Esteemed guests and delegates, good afternoon and welcome to the session titled Evolution of Strategy, Can Policymakers Keep Up? My name is Neal Kushwaha and I have the honor and responsibility of moderating this panel. It is my first panel to moderate at SciCon and I'm excited to do it. Hopefully I will do justice. As strategy and policy advisors and writers know very well that several NATO members have recently published updated cyber policies, while AI has become more accessible to any and all users, and quantum capabilities are both an enabler and a threat. What are the challenges and processes of developing cyber policies and strategy? Do they have the desired results? And how does cyber policy affect interstate relations within the alliance? These are some of the questions that we pose today. We have three outstanding speakers, each giving a talk, followed by time for a panel discussion. During the discussion period, I encourage our audience to drive the conversation with your questions. So I'll start by introducing, in order from closest to me, Andrew. Andrew's a lecturer in information security at Royal Holloway, University of London, and PhD graduate of the University of Oxford. He is the lead of the UK Offensive Cyber Working Group. And that's a very short intro for all of these because we're trying to keep time, but you can indeed read about them on the website. Robin is the Specialist Director of Cybersecurity at the Ministry of Justice and Public Security of Norway. There we are, some Norway folks right up front. He's been instrumental in developing Norway's approach to cybersecurity. He led the Norwegian team that drafted the fourth Norway cybersecurity strategy. He has been at the ministry for 15 years. It's quite some time. That's impressive. And in addition to the field of cybersecurity, he has over the years worked with the national preparedness and emergency planning within several areas. And then we have Treena, a fellow Canadian. Excellent. Treena is the section head for cyber and emerging technology policy at Canada's Department of National Defence. She provides policy support to the Canadian Armed Forces with regards to the conduct of cyber operations. Her policy development and implementation experience includes work focused on NATO and Canada's bilateral defence relations with the EU and France. So I'm going to stray from the order of names listed in the program and start with Andrew and his paper in this year's SciCon publication, which I hope you had a chance to review his abstract, and if not, he will do a great job reviewing it himself in his entire paper. But then we'll follow with the perspectives of the other two strategy developers and policy advisors here, Robin Bakke, Norwegian's Ministry of Justice and Public Security perspective, and then we have Treena Watson, Canada's National Defence perspective. And that being said, we should preface that this panel consists of the opinions of the individuals and not necessarily the opinions of the respective governments. There we go. And with that out of the way, I will pass the floor to Andrew.
Thank you very much, Neal, for such a kind introduction. And hello, everyone. So let me, this slide has just appeared. So before I start, I just want to say that I co-wrote this paper with Dr. Joe Devani at King's College London, who fortunately can't be here because he's got much more exciting personal developments than being at SciCon. So what I'm going to talk about today is how the UK has developed over the past 15 or so years, and in particular with its new branding around responsible democratic cyberpower, or as we like to brand it, RDCP. And so what I'm going to do is give that brief history of where the UK's come from and how it shapes a particular interpretation of cyberpower away from cybersecurity. Then what I'm going to do is go into a bit more depth about, well, what is cyberpower for the UK? And what does it mean to be both responsible in the sense that we conventionally understand within international law and norms, and this more unusual aspect of a democratic, which we've actually heard quite a lot of discussion about already today. And then I'll reflect somewhat on what the future of RDCP is, and what it means for medium-sized cyberpowers. So the UK is a relatively small player in comparison to some larger states, and so it needs to articulate a slightly different position on what cyberpower is for such size states. So, we all started officially in the 2009 National Cybersecurity Strategy. And what this did, it provided an overview of where the UK was thinking. So this didn't emerge out of nowhere. There was lots of intergovernmental discussions prior to 2009. And it was fundamentally very, very brief, at only 32 pages long. And it was created by the Cabinet Office's Office of Cybersecurity and the Cybersecurity Operations Centre, which was led by GCHQ. And that relationship of GCHQ, the Government Communications Headquarters in the UK, has been a consistent theme. And these were relatively new organisations which were starting to respond to the need for thinking about cybersecurity in the UK. And it followed the UK's National Cybersecurity Strategy. So, as I said, it doesn't just emerge out of nowhere. It fits into a broader strategic thinking and landscape of what the UK was doing towards the end of its Labour administration that began in 1997 under Tony Blair, and at this point under Gordon Brown. And the former director of GCHQ, Robert Hannigan, called this a scoping phase. So it was a brief purview into what the UK might be thinking about. It wasn't meant to provide too much detail, and that comes a bit later. So here we move to 2011. The Labour administration has ended, and there's a coalition government between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats. And there was perpetual concern around in the coalition government around the war on terror and its effects, and trying to distance itself from the previous Labour administration. And as you can see by the 4 different boxes underneath that strategy, it's a bit more developed than what had happened before. And it was responding to an increasing salience of cyber operations. So Stuxnet in 2010, and then, or at least when it was revealed, and then following on from that during the implementation of strategy, many others. But it was an effort to reshape the cyber agenda. And this really comes in what I think is the subtitle of this strategy, which is protecting and promoting the UK in a digital world. This was so different to the 2009 strategy, which had really just been this broad sweep of what's going on. Here, the UK is going on the front foot. It's trying to think what its position in the world is. It's not just a technical document anymore. And there's also significant money that comes from this, £860 million. And for anyone who knows about UK politics at this period, this was post-2008 when there was significant fiscal consolidation or austerity of UK public finances. This was one of the very, very few places that got a huge boost in income or spending by the government. And it integrated with various other national security policies. So this includes the National Cybersecurity Strategy, as well as strategic security and defence reviews. And so it's couched within this broader way of thinking about how the UK approached it. So here we see again that cyber strategy isn't independent. It's completely integrated into a broader schema. 5 years later, we're in 2016, and the world has changed significantly, especially for the UK. It was published post-Brexit, so there was already a changing relationship geopolitically, and we had witnessed the first invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and there was a real change in dynamics with discussions on China. In the previous government, so this was published under Theresa May, there had been a really close golden relationship with China. This completely changed by 2016. And so we see a very, very different type of relationship, and this is reflected somewhat in the strategy geopolitically. And so there was also a more active role for the UK government. So we might think of this as a whole of government strategy. In that previously, it had been primarily around market dynamics. So thinking to this morning's keynotes, I think it's really interesting that we saw that in discussion with the US, which we'd really already seen this prior to 2016 within the UK, that actually the market can't provide security incentives as well as it could do. And probably most commonly known is the creation of the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre. So here it integrated various disparate components around the UK's landscape. So we had got the assurance processes from GCHQ, parts of critical national infrastructure, as well as its CERT, all combined into one to create a strategic point of contact and way of disseminating information about cybersecurity across society in a way that wasn't coming, at least perceived to be, not coming directly from an intelligence agency. So NCSC sits under GCHQ, but is a public-facing part of that. And there was also a formation of a National Offensive Cyber Programme. So here you can start to see that the UK is already starting to articulate what its offensive or projection of capabilities are. It's just not necessarily integrated at this point. And then we came to the 2022 strategy, which is actually published in December 21, rather confusingly. And what it does, it further strengthens, it adds another pillar, or an extra pillar at the very least, to its top-level strategic priorities. And it says in the National Cyber Strategy, it wants to make more integrated, creative, and routine use of the UK's full spectrum of levers. As you may have noticed on the image, there is the dropping of the word security. The framing concept for UK strategy has changed somewhat. And I think what you can see here is that the need to project power, or how to talk about projection of power through offensive capability, needs to be integrated, and it can't really sit comfortably within cybersecurity. And before this strategy was released, there was the avowal of a new organization, the National Cyber Force, which developed out of the National Offensive Cyber Programme. And this is a joint intelligence military organization and some other organizations beyond that as well, including, for example, DSTL, the Defense Security Technology Laboratory. And Nick Beecroft, who wrote a really good piece on this, says it moves cyber strategy from one of technical implementation around government to one which is much more about grand strategy. What does the UK want to achieve internationally, and how does it bring together a whole of society approach in doing that? So we've got these different pillars, let's say, of UK cyber security strategies across this period. And you can start to roughly map. This is not the best of mappings, but I thought I would show it. And in particular, what we see from 2011 is a real focus internationally. So you've got this scoping phase from 2009, and then by 2011, the international becomes really important to the UK, when it's really figured out what cybersecurity strategy should do. And over the years, they increasingly get more and more complex across the cyber strategies, to the point where you can start to see the interrelationships between these different pillars. They may be called different things, but there's a significant amount of continuity between 2009 to 2022, just reprioritizations, I would argue. So what I've done is just give you a very, very brief overview of the different parts of cyber strategy from 2009 onwards in the UK. But the 2022 strategy talks about responsible democratic cyberpower. And this again, is drawn partially from the UK's Integrated Review, which was a broad strategic overview of what the UK should be doing more broadly that was released prior to this cyber strategy. And so what I'm going to do in this next section is talk about, well, how does the UK think about cyberpower, and then go into a bit more depth about that responsible and democratic elements. So here's another quote from the UK's National Cyber Strategy 2022, an ever more vital layer of national power and a source of strategic advantage. It is the ability to protect and promote national interests in and through cyberspace. For me, this is really distinctly different to what we saw in prior strategies. So as much as I talked about continuity between the different pillars previously, here we're starting to see a very different part of what's happening from 2022 onwards. And it's partly to deal with the transforming cybersecurity landscape. So in this period, we saw the huge growth of ransomware between 2016 and 2022. That really wasn't such a dominant theme. How do you tackle that? That requires a much more robust response. It's not as passive. It requires an activist interpretation. There's many different ways of doing that, of course. And there's a changing role of government across these various iterations of strategy. In 2011, although it's a whole of government approach, it does tell society to get on with it. Let private industry go on. Whereas by 2022, we see this whole of society where there is a government actor, but it's situated within this broader way of thinking. And it was developing in an even more complex geopolitical relationship than what had happened in 2016. So the UK is seeing what can it do in the world? What does it do outside the European Union? What is its strategic priorities? And crucially, as much as what cyberpower may suggest, it's not just about projection of national interest. It does try and fuse, in different ways, aspects of cybersecurity with this newer language. And so this includes diplomacy, capacity building skills, technological development, etc. And we can't forget this man, GCHQ Director Sir Jeremy Fleming, who actually I think is his last day in office today before he's replaced by Anne Keith-Butler. But in February 2019 is where we actually see the first proper articulation of cyberpower within any UK communication. And he's very clear that he does not want this to be seen as a conventional military understanding of power. And so I think this is a theme that we'll continue going back to, is that the UK doesn't want to be understood in the conventional sense. It's not cyberpower in the way that we may have talked about it in the past, or at least that's what the UK government wants us to think, perhaps. So why responsible and democratic? Well, I think there's some clear reasons for doing this. It's about understanding that there is this changing role of a state, that there has to be a working between, and that requires both acting responsibly with stakeholders as well as democratically doing so. How transparent should those be? And that comes out in whole of nation. There was a phrase, whole of cyber, which was thankfully dropped, and the whole of society. And crucially, another point is around the differentiation from adversaries. So what actions are they doing in cyberspace? What are they promoting? And also allies. It had learnt from the US's experience of discussing offensive cyber and projection of cyberpower, and said, we need to talk about this in a clearly distinct way. We do not want to get into the same trouble that the US had a few years ago. And it means that there's a responsibility, at least in offensive cyber, for the operations and behavior of those, and the democratic oversight mechanisms and the procedures to get there. So in conversations with some people from the UK government, some people said that the democratic referred to participatory ways of understanding. So I think there was a mismatch between the word and what some people wanted to get out of that. So it doesn't mean democratic as in the forceful understanding of that you must be a democracy. It's about what are the processes typically associated with democracy, but it doesn't have to be democracy itself. And that really didn't come across in UK strategy very well. And ultimately, it's about the broader competition geopolitically with middle ground states. So can you say, yes, we are going to be doing cyber operations. We've got respect in cybersecurity from our National Cybersecurity Center, and we need to be able to say, we're doing this responsibly and in a democratic way. It's providing a model or a type of model for other states to follow. So I've given a bit of an overview around responsible democratic, but then there's a particular UK understanding of what this might be. So it's around what we classically might think as cybersecurity strategy. So around cyber ecosystem, the provision of sovereign assets, everything we might want to see in a conventional cyber security strategy. It's about diplomatic efforts in accord with national interest and democratic values. And I think I really want to emphasize the values around that, and including capacity building, which the UK has conventionally done fairly well. And it's operating responsibly through practicing restraint, proportionality, and around international rules and norms. This is quite difficult for the UK. It has quite a unique interpretation around international law around some of these issues. But in the National Cyber Force's latest publication, their only publication that we're likely to see, they talk about accountability, precision, and calibration as the guiding principles for their operations. How that fits with transparency and democracy, you might want to go and have a think about a bit more, we could discuss. And it's about emphasizing that liberal democratic side. So as much as the UK doesn't want to explicitly say that you should do this, it wants to follow this broad model that the UK outside of the European Union and in a very difficult geopolitical context will thrive. If there's a change against that liberal democratic order, the UK will find that a very difficult place to live and succeed. So I'm moving towards wrapping up because I realize I'm taking up some time. But there are some obvious challenges for RDCP. I've identified 3 here and in the paper. And first, it's around quantification, measurement, metrics. What does it mean? How do you evaluate your responsible and democratic behavior? In cyber operations, what does that look like? How might you build and say, yes, this is something which we think is going to be good for our transparency or our accountability or the calibration, as well as in other areas. And there's also such a vast diversity of interpretations of especially democratic, but also of responsibility. Responsibility can look very, very different to different actors. And so this is a challenge for RDCP to clearly articulate what these are for UK strategy. It's not clear how exactly the UK wants to talk about these things. And third, it's around power itself. Is cyber power a useful way of thinking about the role of the UK in cyber diplomacy? In a report published by the Foreign Office in the UK, there was a participant at an event that was held, and it talks about powerlessness. Many states feel powerless in cybersecurity. And so what does it mean when someone says, I've got cyber power? What is that trying to say? Is that really helping the UK's interests? And ultimately, it's also around, when you start talking about democratic, transparency and accountability, domestically and internationally. The UK strategy does try and talk about what this looks like domestically. It's got a very nice diagram about how all the authorizations roughly are meant to flow. But it also can't talk about it in many ways. The National Cyber Force, for example, is not a public-facing organization. It's very, very different to, for example, US Cyber Command. It just doesn't do things in the same way. And so I wrote a piece with the former chief executive of the National Cybersecurity Center, Kieran Martin, where we coined this Ronan Keating doctrine, which is roughly saying it best when saying nothing at all. And hopefully some people know what that song is, because it's really good, in my opinion anyway. So here what we're saying is that how do you try and articulate cyber power responsibly, democratically, when you also can't really reveal very much? And what are the equities in that decision-making, and how do you talk about that is really, really tough domestically and internationally. So very quickly, some conclusions for both the UK and elsewhere. It's all about achieving that balance in the projection of power and still promoting cybersecurity. No state wants to say, we're not interested in cybersecurity anymore. But there also needs to be a promotion of interest in a world that's becoming very, very difficult to be in. So if you're talking about particular technical standards, if you're wanting to stop cyber criminals, that requires a different way of doing things to what the 2016, 2011, 2009 strategies talk about. And does this achieve longer-term beneficial outcomes in cyberspace for the UK's national interests and others? Is cyberpower a useful trope, or should we go back to cybersecurity? And fundamentally, it's underdeveloped, which has its benefits in that there might be some traction here for other states to follow. If other states are thinking about how they might want to talk about their cyber capabilities and what they're doing with them, but in a way that doesn't disavow their work in cybersecurity, perhaps this is a way for middle states that don't want to, for example, say that they are going to be persistently engaging at all points. Most states cannot do that, but there's other things that you might want to do. And for me, is the democratic element useful, or should we go back to the more conventional responsible state behavior, which is much more universally understood and makes sense to other states? And Sir Jeremy Fleming was the key architect in producing cyberpower. Will it survive his departure? Will the bureaucratic politics and leadership be there? There's multiple interpretations within the UK government about what cyberpower is, and then multiple interpretations again about what responsible and democratic is. Will it all just fall apart? So I guess we'll see, perhaps in the 2026 or 27 strategy, how long that holds. But thank you very much.
So as I said, we'll try and hold off the questions to the end, but I will quickly lead with one just to keep fueling this fire. So you just gave a great recap of the past 4 cybersecurity to cyber power, basically development of policy and through strategy in the UK. And with the changing of hands and changing of guard, maybe we could say, from Jeremy to Anne, happening, probably already happened today, as I haven't followed, but I assume it has. I wonder if you could pull out a crystal ball and tell us what you believe would be upcoming strategy with Anne possibly in play.
That's a great question. I think it depends where UK strategy goes more generally. So the UK has been talking about this Indo-Pacific tilt, and there's again pressure on UK finances. Can it be a full spectrum power at all points across the world? And so I think that will have a big influence about how that may change, especially if there's a new administration next year. And cyberpower will sit alongside that. It's an enabling function. I think there'll be much more potential critique around whole of society, and this is something I also harbour, is what does that mean? It's a great catch-all term, but it doesn't really talk about the power relationships between different parts of government and different bodies out, and who's got responsibility for what. So when we talk about whole of society, it means that we can say, yes, everyone's got responsibility, but it really needs to be articulated. And so I think we'll see that movement forward. And there could also be, I guess I'll give a hope rather than necessarily a prediction, that what we'll see is a much more open, transparent way of understanding how all these different elements fit together. Yes, you don't want to compromise equities in that process, but you do need to, if you're wanting to do this responsibly and democratically, especially domestically, because it tends to be about international democratic. So it's about how much blowback there might be upon domestic politics. There might be none, but we'll see. So potentially that's why it might get dropped, I think. But we do see it re-articulated still today. So
very cool. Thank you. we'll carry on with Robin's piece here. Thank you.
Yes, hello everyone, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. It's a really honor to be a part of this panel today. First time I came to CyCon was back in 2010, and I remember back then I was really impressed how many experts it gathered from around the world. And seeing that this conference still is going strong so many years later really proves that this is the place to be to discuss cyber among friends. In Norway, the Ministry of Justice and Public Security, we coordinate cybersecurity across the whole of the civilian sector, and we do that in close cooperation with the Ministry of Defense that has the responsibility on the military side. Today I will go through three main pillars. I will talk a bit about our latest strategy from 2019 and put it in a larger historic context to show you how we've been working strategically over time. I will give you insight into the drafting process of the 2019 strategy that I was responsible for, and also a bit about the strategy itself and what we did differently this time compared to the previous strategies. But to start off, please read this and have a guess for yourself when you think it was written. Probably some of the words will give away it was not written yesterday. But I don't think many of you would have guessed that it was actually written in 1986.
Wow.
And I think back then it was probably for the few special interested. But coming back to our time with the speed of digitalization and where everybody now is talking about the digital value chains, it's such much more topical. So you could probably just change the use of electronic data processing with cyber ICT, and it would be more valid today than back then. But the point here is also, it shows that things we're dealing with today, we've been working with for a long time. And I think you will recognize from a lot of strategies, talking about building competence, handling cyber attacks, protecting critical infrastructures, is something we had to work on a long time span and will be covering over several strategies. Okay, Norway. I like to start normally in the year of 2000. In Norway, we use a lot of independent committees to look independently on different areas of society and come with a lot of recommendations for us. And in 2000, we had a independent committee looking at vulnerabilities in society. And they emphasize ICT as one of the main building blocks of society, and had several recommendations on how to reduce the risk associated with this development. And they recommended, among one of the actions, that Norway should produce our own national cybersecurity strategy. And that resulted in us releasing our first one in 2003, and we became the second country in the world to release such a strategy, only beaten by the US that released their strategy some months before us the same year. And that was followed up in a new version in 2007 and then in 2012. And about 15 years after the previous independent committee for vulnerabilities, we had our first independent committee solely looking at digital vulnerabilities. They looked at sector-specific vulnerabilities and cross-sectorial, and they had heaps of recommendations. It was widely acknowledged. It was a really good report, and it lay a very good foundation for our first white paper on cybersecurity from 2017. And I was responsible for the drafting process of that white paper, and I knew at that time we would also be producing a new national cybersecurity strategy, so we could use the white paper for a stepping stone again for our next strategy. And when we released our fourth cybersecurity strategy, we became the first country in the world to produce a fourth one, but it's not the point trying to produce the most strategies. But what I'm trying to convey here is that we've been working strategically, step by step, building on previous experiences when we release a strategy. Also, last year in December, we released a white paper on national control and digital resilience to safeguard national security, showing how we are combining different areas and taking a step further. Okay, to bring you up to speed with the drafting process. As I mentioned, the white paper from 2017 was a very good stepping stone. And in that white paper, it said that the Minister of Justice, together with the MFA, Minister of Defense, was responsible. And previously, we had several ministries responsible altogether. And then we needed all to agree on which level we should have the strategy. So I think it was important to show that the two main ministries responsible was given the task. And I'm quite sure if we sat down in the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Justice, in total isolation, we would be able to produce a very good strategy. And people would think, yeah, you touched upon the right areas. But then I think we would have failed. So what I wanted was to have the most open strategy process we have ever conducted, inviting everybody in Norwegian society from the very beginning to be included in the drafting process. And that I think is very important, because if you want to have a successful implementation by the stakeholders, you need to bring them along on the ride. You have to make sure that they perceive the strategy as relevant and they have the ownership to it. So what we did was to have a large opening conference for the process itself before we started drafting. We got the Prime Minister and a couple of ministers to open the conference, and everybody in the Norwegian society that wanted to attend was invited. And we gave them, and this was important to get the top level ownership also for the strategy. And we invited everybody that wanted to have elevated pitch, given 90 seconds to take the floor and say what they thought was the most important thing to address in the strategy. In addition to that, everybody that wanted to could come with written input to the strategy. And for us, it was important to use the international community as well. We had bilateral meetings with the UK, with Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, and also Estonia. We visited ENISA to talk to their cybersecurity strategy experts, and also, of course, NATO, CCD, COE, to get feedback on our 2012 strategy, discuss what we thought about our 2019 strategy, and we felt committed to produce a good strategy when we released the fourth one, being the first. So really learning and having input from the international community. And of course, there is no point having a good strategy if no one really knows it's being released. So we really wanted to have a large kick-off conference where we again got the Prime Minister and 5 ministers to really present the strategy and showing that this is not a strategy for a few ministers, but it's for all sectors to follow up on. Just some small lessons learned we did from previous strategies. We did not set an expiration date on the strategy, because the 2012 strategy, it was the drafting process came to life because the previous one expired. Not because it was perceived needed, but we had to rush it because we had set an expiration date. And I believe strongly that you should let a strategy live as long as you believe it's relevant. It might be after 1 year, 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, but that gives you that flexibility. The 2012 strategy, because of the hurry of releasing it and the commitment to the Parliament, it was released just before Christmas in 2012. So I think everybody was occupied with Christmas preparations, and I don't think many really realized that we got a new national cybersecurity strategy. So what we did with this one, we released it in the beginning of the year of 2019, and really being able to kickstart a new year with a new strategy, getting all the attention, and having a whole year in front of us to really to start new work. It was important to have a separate action plan, to really have the flexibility to be able to update the action plan independently of the strategy. And not at least, thinking about who is your target audience. We wanted national strategy to be for everyone in Norway, so we need to have a easy, understandable language, make it easy for all levels, not having a technical language, and make it short and attractive to really make it raise the chances for people really reading the whole strategy. And for not just having the strategy in your desk or in your drawer, we had a poster in the middle that you could hang up on your wall and have the strategy in front of you every day over the main priorities. And of course, at the same time as we released it, we wanted to share back with the international community. So we had also the action plan translated in an English version, so we could share and play with open cards. The strategy itself has 5 areas. I won't go into the 5 areas, but the core here is the cooperation dimensions, the public-private cooperation, the civil-military, and the international cooperation, really embracing the prioritized areas. And the action plan that previously had only actions for the government itself, we wanted actions for all companies, large or small, to be able to follow up on and to contribute. This to raise the security level in each company in Norway, but through that also raising our collective security, and through that really making it a national strategy, not for the few, but for everyone. And as a strategy itself, we set down a group consisting of both public and private entities, experts, and also end users to come to find out what are the 10 basic advice you would give to all companies in Norway. It didn't matter if you were large or small, what could you agree on would be the 10 most important. They had several workshops with consultant companies and such, and these were the 10 they came up with. So what are the main differences between the 3 previous strategies and the latest? Before, we had more focus on the civilian side by giving the Ministry of Defense a co-ownership. We got a strategy that covered both military and civilian sectors. So we have one strategy in Norway covering the whole of Norway. Previous strategies had very little when it came to the international dimension. And this time we really wanted to emphasize the importance of the international dimension. And at that time we did have an international cyber strategy, but we took the part that contained cybersecurity and incorporated into the national strategy. So for the end user, you only had one strategy covering whole of Norway and the international dimension. And also, as I just mentioned, we go from having measures only for the authorities to have measures that everybody can contribute with. And we went from previous strategies where we give overall guidelines from the authorities to really recognizing that cooperation and partnerships are vital to address and meet the needs in the area. And it's easier probably to talk about public-private partnerships and cooperation than actually doing it. But I believe the way we did the strategy in itself is a proof that we are willing to walk our talk. And what I forgot to mention is when we drafted the strategy, also when we had around 70% finished draft of it, we invited everyone that had contributed. We didn't care if you were a private person or from a private company. You were invited into the workshop. We showed you our cards. Here's what we have. What do you think? How can we improve it? We can have discussions so that they really felt they were part of the strategy process throughout the whole process. The 2017 white paper had the undertitle, A Shared Responsibility. And this drawing we just made to prove that this is something we're all in the same boat. So with that, thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll have Treena present her perspective from our national defense side in Canada. Please.
Thanks, Neal. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here at SciCon for the first time, so thank you so much for having me. Since my co-panelists gave such great overviews of their country's respective cyber strategies and policy landscape, I thought that I'd begin by giving you a little bit more of a picture of Canada's landscape as well. And since Andrew did such a great job doing like the academic analysis of cyber strategies, and Robin really honed in on the policy development and strategy development angle, I thought it'd be nice and complementary for me to maybe hone in a little bit more on the policy implementation and what happens behind the scenes. So hopefully that fits in nice with the rest of the narrative today. So starting with Canada's current cyber policy landscape, I won't go too far into the past, but Our national approach to cyber has, to this point, been fairly focused on cybersecurity, cyber resilience, and growing our national cyber ecosystem. These focus areas are very much reflected in our national cybersecurity strategy, which was published in 2018, but is currently being renewed right now. As Andrew highlighted, actually, as there's a growing recognition of the role of cyber operations and how they can play a part in national strategies. And in fact, the UK's responsible cyberpower in practice document that Andrew went into detail about highlights that while resiliency can be at the heart of a nation's defense strategy, being secure in cyberspace also requires the ability to actively tackle the cyber dependencies of your adversaries. And one way a nation can do that is through cyber operations. Canada recognizes this, and that's why in our 2017 strategy, Strong, Secure, Engaged, it directed the Canadian Armed Forces to take a more assertive posture in the cyber domain through hardening our defenses, developing and using offensive cyber capabilities, and conducting cyber operations in support of government-authorized military operations. We've been rolling out on this direction since 2017. For example, in response to Russian aggression in early 2022, the Canadian Armed Forces immediately deployed a cyber task force to help Russia bolster its cyber defense capabilities. Additionally, because we know the threat isn't just limited to Ukraine, last year we also deployed a persistent cyber task force to Riga to conduct joint threat hunt operations with our partner Latvia. These operations assist Latvia defending itself from cyber threats, and they also demonstrate Canada's unwavering commitment to its allies. Now, in the cyber domain, the Canadian Armed Forces often partner with our National Signals Intelligence Agency, Communications Security Establishment, or CSE. Some of you may know CSE gained an extended mandate in 2019 to conduct defensive cyber operations as well as active cyber operations. And I'd be remiss not to mention our partners at our Foreign Affairs Ministry, Global Affairs Canada. They also play a very strong role in the cyber domain, including by championing the advancement of responsible state behavior in cyberspace on a global stage. That's for you, Art. I see you cheering at the back. In our cyber-related policies, Canada has been very vocal about our commitment to conducting cyber operations in a responsible manner. Our cyber operations are subject to applicable international law, domestic law, and also give due regard to the voluntary and non-binding norms of responsible behavior, such as those agreed to at the UN General Assembly. In addition, the Canadian Armed Forces also operate within a very robust governance framework with proven checks and balances. Last year, Canada released our statement on the applicability of international law in cyberspace. It outlines our current view of some key aspects of international law and goes into depth about how we believe these aspects apply. These types of statements can really increase international dialogue and the development of common understanding and consensus on what is lawful and responsible state behavior in cyberspace. Beyond that, these kind of statements can also reduce the risk of misunderstanding and escalation between states that can sometimes arise from cyber activities. Canada realizes that to ensure cyber resiliency and security at home, we also have to be engaged abroad. As part of our Indo-Pacific strategy, which was very recently released, Canada launched a multi-departmental initiative that's going to help regional partners develop cybersecurity capabilities. To support this effort, the Department of National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces is increasing our cyber engagement and cooperation with our defence counterparts in the region. That includes, for example, our counterparts in Japan, in the Republic of Korea, and in Singapore. So as you can see, the current cyber-related policy and strategy landscape is quite rich. But it's also evolving. As I mentioned, our national cybersecurity strategy is well underway to being renewed. And also, you may have heard that we are undergoing a defense policy review as well, a defense policy update. Hopefully it gave you a sufficiently high-level overview of just kind of the current state and gave you a little bit of an idea of how the Canadian Armed Forces are employed to achieve objectives beyond just traditional defense ones. So I'd like to now turn, as promised, to a little bit of the nitty-gritty, the behind the scenes. And I think that jives, what I have to say jives really well with this year's theme of CyberCon, which is meeting reality. Because at the end of the day, there's the theory of cyber policy, but then there's the reality of what has to go on behind the scenes to enable that policy, and the reality of how the policy actually plays out. And I've been witness, and I know a lot of people here, and a lot of my colleagues in this room have been witness to both of these. So I've been asked to share some of my ground level experience and insights. As Neal mentioned, a core part of my job is supporting the Canadian Armed Forces through policy development and support and implementation. So my comments may be a little bit more defense-oriented. I'd like to first build on a point that Robin made when he said, the importance about using basic, easy-to-understand language. And I'd go even a step further, just on the importance of language. In addition to the easy-to-understand language, I'd caution that when you're developing cyber policy, you have to be really careful about using language that could be too prescriptive or too proscriptive. Policymakers should really focus on communicating the desired strategic effect in a way that allows for flexibility in how those effects can be achieved. At the end of the day, I'm just a policy person. I'm not a technical cyber expert. So you really have to leave room for the operational level to come up with some creative solutions. Also helps with enduring, long-lasting strategy as well. This leads me to my next point, which is creating linkages between policymakers like myself at the strategic level and the people who actually implement that policy at the operational and tactical levels. It's important for people like myself to really understand the needs, the limitations, the barriers, the bottlenecks that the operational and tactical levels face day to day, so that I can pursue appropriate policy solutions. I need to understand the problem so that I can fix it. And you don't always get that insight if you keep yourself at that strategic level. You have to build those lateral linkages. In addition to this, the importance of lashing up laterally, I'd say horizontal alignment is equally as important. With the growth of military-civilian partnerships in the cyber domain, bridge building is essential to fostering unity of approach in cyber. Civilians working for the military, like myself, can play really key roles in being that translator, translating military strategy, policy, activities, jargon, to something that's easily understood by civilian departments and agencies. And likewise, we can be that key conduit of bringing more awareness and understanding of civilian cyber lines of effort as well, and socializing that with the military. So being that back and forth. And as already has been touched on many times throughout the morning, this bridge building really does need to extend to industry as well. As most of us in this room know, cyber can be an intimidating topic. The learning curve is very steep. This is why my fourth point here is education and socialization, and why they're such important lines of effort for policy makers and policy implementers to both pursue. The president of Estonia himself this morning highlighted the importance of awareness building, and as did every single one of the cyber commanders on that stage. Whether it's briefing senior decision makers or the public, never underestimate the ability to explain cyber in layman's terms. Greater understanding of cyber and of the activities we conduct in cyberspace is crucial to ensuring our license to operate and paving the way for successful policy development. I know the majority of our panel has really been focused on traditional forms of policy, like white papers, defense strategies, national cybersecurity strategies, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight that there are less traditional forms and vehicles we can use to advance policy. And these opportunities come up a lot more frequently than the 3 to 5 year renewal cycle of a defense policy or of a national cybersecurity strategy, right? These alternative sources can include high-level speeches, interviews, press releases, statements, things like that. In fact, just about 25 minutes ago, on the other side of the ocean, our Minister of National Defence used a speech at a defence industry conference to announce that Canada is establishing a cybersecurity certification program in Canada. And this program is going to be intended to help protect our defence industry. We're doing this in lockstep with the US in order to bring a harmonized approach for defence companies that supply both of our countries. The last piece of insight I'd like to impart is that having a policy or strategy itself is only one part of the equation. Right? To implement a cyber policy or strategy, you often need funding, personnel, you need the capabilities, you need the capacity, you need the authorities. And after General Sir Hawkenhall's remarks this morning, I'd add you need supporting process. Not having any of these elements can be showstoppers, even if you do have policy cover. So to sum up these insights, I'd say when it comes to cyber policy, you have to keep in mind the bigger picture. You have to make a concerted effort to educate key stakeholders, and that includes yourself. And partnerships, partnerships, partnerships. This is actually a nice segue to a question that Neal posed and that was posed in the panel description. And that's, how does cyber policy affect interstate relations within the alliance? Cyber policies can play a vital role in signaling national intent in terms of cyber investment, capability development, and priorities. This can be integral information for allies and partners to have to help plan for and ensure interoperability. It also allows for synergies and potential cooperation areas to be identified and gives us opportunities to reduce duplication or to at least make our parallel efforts a little bit more complementary. There's certainly been, I've certainly witnessed a shift anyways, and a growing emphasis on campaign mindset in a lot of national cyber strategies, including those recently released by the UK and the US. The campaign mindset, what it means is it's weaving together cyber operations with other sources of national power, diplomatic, informational, military, economic. And it's weaving those elements together to achieve national objectives and to achieve longer-term outcomes. Now, I think this is a really important evolution in strategy because individually, cyber operations can't usually be counted on or expected to deliver strategically decisive effects on their own. They are most impactful when combined and coordinated with a wider set of activities involving other partners, and that includes the activities of our allies. We're already seeing evidence of effective cyber campaigning among allied militaries, in fact. For example, as I mentioned, the Canadian Armed Forces have deployed a cyber task force to Latvia. Recently, our cyber task force had the opportunity to work in tandem with a team from US Cyber Command on defensive cyber threat hunting operations focused on Latvian critical infrastructure. These activities helped us gain invaluable knowledge and experience against the cyber tactics of adversaries, and this experience can be directly applied to strengthen our mutual cyber resilience and defense. It also allowed us to cover a lot more area than we would have been able to if we were just operating on our own. Beyond cyber operations, cyber policies can help enable cooperation and coordination in areas such as cyber threat intelligence sharing, capacity development of third countries, and even protection of the defense supply chain through, for example, cybersecurity certification, as I mentioned earlier. I've talked a lot about importance of partnerships in my remarks. I think we've heard a lot about the importance of partnerships throughout the first day of CyCon. I'm sure I'm not going to be the last to emphasize that point, but I really do think it's because our global network of allies and partners represents perhaps the most fundamental advantage we have in the cyber domain. And cyber policy can be can play a very big role in enhancing and expanding that. So I think with that, I'll stop. I'd like to leave some time for some interactive discussions because I know my panelists are very knowledgeable, so I will pass the mic back to Neal.
Thank you very much, Treena. And thank you to all of our panelists here. I think we did answer a few of these questions, and on the onset we said, what are the challenges of of developing these and processes of developing these strategies and policies. Some of those questions have been answered with a bit of the history from the UK side, your experience in the strategy side, and your implementation of the policy side. So I believe that we've done a reasonable effort to answer that question. Do they have the desired results? I'm going to sit down for this because I feel like we're just going to have a good conversation, and with your help as well and in your questions, we're going to have a few more. And then finally, thank you very much for answering the question on the interstate relationships within the alliance. I think that helps a lot. Indeed, if there are further questions on those or any others, I do welcome. When you do get the microphone, please do state your name and your affiliation when you get that opportunity. Maybe I'll kick it off if that's okay. I had some little scribbles of questions that I put aside just in case to kick off this discussion. So in 2017, here at CyCon, Admiral Howard, I don't know if you recall her walking up and down the aisles in the hotel. In past years, she stated that cyber moves at the speed of light. I bet you've heard many folks use that terminology, but I do recall her saying it. And knowing that strategy and policy requires a significant amount of thought, time, public input like you've already presented and suggested, and democratic and political discussion, what are your opinions on strategies and policies, quote, keeping up in line with our panel, and are they truly meeting reality? So I'll let you maybe carry on in the order that we discussed. Go ahead, please, Andrew.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting quote. I don't think cyber moves at the speed of light, both from a technical perspective and from an institutional perspective. If we look at, for example, Max Schmitz's work on military cyber forces, for example, we see that actually there's a huge amount of bureaucratic work that sits behind creating cyber ops, but also all parts of cybersecurity require time. And so if you're a cyber criminal, you need to develop your processes, you need to work out what your vulnerability you're going to exploit, etc. So really cyber doesn't move at the speed of light, but there is a point where it moves a bit quicker. But going back to policy, I think what's really interesting is that we're not just passive observers, right? We shape what's possible in the future as well. So it's not that we're trying to keep up, it's about how do we want to shape the future in which we want to construct. So I think that's probably much more the expertise of two colleagues here, so I think I'll pass it on.
Thank you.
Thank you. I also think that like the strategy itself is just one of the tools, and like I tried to convey that some of the things we're working with are long-term and will stand over time. So I think if you go back and look at early strategies, you will find some of the things we still are working with. And it's also how the level of the strategy itself. You can talk about addressing emerging threats, technology in large, and not talking about AI and quantum, but so you can still work on the detail level, addressing the overall challenges. And it's a nature of policy that you start working with policy when after you have a problem. So you will always be lagging a bit behind. And I don't know how much more you're lagging behind in this area compared to other areas. It's probably also a relevant question. And you still are working on different policy that might not be in a white paper or a national cybersecurity strategy as well. So it's a combination of things. Yeah.
I think I'd agree with Robin a lot. As I mentioned in my comments, it's important to remember that policy is only one part of the equation. So if we build policy and develop policy in a way, as Robin said, that's strategic and leaves room, and you know, the language that we use is not just present day, addressing present problems and putting a date on it, for example. I really like that point that you made in your speech about not dating things, because then you're rushing to renew. Sometimes it's nice to have a due date, though. Sometimes it is nice to have that prompt, which is great. But if we can develop strategies that are longer lasting and do that in a very direct way, it would be helpful. But like I said, policy is one part of the equation. And I think it was talked about this morning as well. What about our processes? Right. Even if we have the policy that we need to have, do our processes necessarily support the agility that we need to have to implement that policy? And if not, how long is it going to take to evolve those processes? I'd also add that when change happens, it happens fast, and it's agility is necessary, and that includes the agility to posture yourself and to defend when it's necessary. But also the agility is required to seize opportunities as well when they come. So keeping that all in mind when we develop policy, hopefully will result in longer term policies. But in the meantime, maybe we can use, as I mentioned again, like some of the alternative forms that we might have in between the policy cycle, like splitting out action plans, like you said, so you leave room for flexibility and for evolving the strategy, a year down the line by releasing an action plan and reacting in the meantime. So there's tips and tricks we can use, I think, to keep up.
Sure. Yeah. This is cool. It's kind of like a workshop on how to write a policy. I think it's fun. Again, if you're a strat pol person, maybe not so much if you're a tech person, but nonetheless, I'm looking to the crowd. If there's any, please, Ingrid, go ahead.
Likely wait for a mic.
Indeed.
My voice doesn't carry at all. Hi everyone. I'm Ingrid from CCD COE. Thank you all for your insight into policy development from three of our favorite members of the Centre, of course.
We paid her to say that.
Well, I'm easily bribable. I wanted to pick up on something Robin said, but really all of you touched upon this, of course, very Norwegian concept of transparency and playing with an open deck and inviting in both our allies and our friends and different sectors. And I'm not sure I have an entirely clear-cut question for you, more that I'd like to invite you all to elaborate on to what effect we are sort of merging and moving towards each other as we cooperate and learn from each other. I'm thinking that between countries more than between sectors. Are we all going to end up to a certain degree with one big policy that, or one big strategy that to a large degree resembles each other? Will we stay individual with our clearly the US and Canada are doing things in lockstep? Is this a development we're going to see more across NATO? Do you see your neighbors developing strategy, roll your eyes a bit and say, oh, I'm definitely not doing that one? Like, if you want to share some insight on that, I think that'd be welcome. Thank you.
That's a very good question. Let's start in the opposite direction this time, just for fun.
Okay. I was looking to Andrew. Thanks for the question. I think ideally that would be great. We're all NATO members. We coordinate at NATO. I believe one of the speakers have already kind of highlighted the ways. This morning was the Assistant Secretary General highlighted some of the ways we're already working together. And as I highlighted in my speech, I made it about cyber operations when I said that individually cyber operations can't be expected to make those big bang effects and impacts, but together we can do something that's more has longer term impact. I think that at the end of the day, nations are always going to have their national equities. So nothing is going to be exact, but I think it's great seeing some common trends come out and really good common trends. Andrew talked about a few of them. But for example, the trend of being very vocal about how we are going to differentiate ourselves, and when I say we, I say the NATO nations. How are we going to differentiate ourselves in cyberspace from the malicious actors in cyberspace? That's a really important conversation. So if we see more allies and partners coming out with strategies that are focused on that, and we're all reflecting the same values and principles, and we're all working towards that goal, unity of strategy. That's beautiful, right? So I'd say that.
Thank you for a great question, Ingrid. I think international cooperation among strategies is very interesting and beneficial. Like it really drives us to learn from each other, having fruitful discussions to take the strategies to the next level. But as you said, Treena, we have also different issues to solve. We are different countries. Some are cyberpowers, some are smaller countries and have more like introvert ambitions, say it like that.
Cyber substations versus cyber powers, right?
And at the same time, we do as well have, at least a lot of us in this room have the same strategy through NATO, through EU and such. So that also binds us together. So yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, these are the two experts. I'm a poor academic in this area. But I think there's something around actually best practices have been a thing that have been happening for quite a while in cybersecurity, right? So the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre will be one example that has really proliferated. It's been seen as really good practice. The danger of having too much best practice is that you don't get enough innovation because this landscape is constantly evolving. And so you always want differentiation as much as you want to align. So it's about getting that balance is probably what I would say around that.
It's an interesting thought. In aligning all of this, it got me thinking that, we all publish our strategies, we all publish our policies, we all describe our legal position or in international law, applicability of international law in cyberspace, for example. But that also, in doing so, we tell our adversaries the precise do not cross this line point, and it kind of helps them know where to play up to and where not to cross over. How do you deal with that in policy development and also advertising your policy to your allies and working with them, yet still, defending your position with your adversaries?
Did you want me to start?
Whoever wants to, I'll leave it up to the. I'm just curious.
I think that as liberal democratic nations, transparency has to be, is integral to how we operate, right? But when it comes to our strategies and our public strategies, you really do have to find that balance between transparency that's needed and the imperative for secrecy, right? So there's a balance that's sought there. But I think for the things, and actually a really good example is, for example, the U.S. Department of Defense just released their cyber strategy, but they released, the unclassified version. There's a classified version, right? So we're keeping some things behind the curtain, but the things that we are putting out in the public are things that we want known. We want the adversaries to know that we are going to defend and protect when we have to. We want them to know that they can't operate with impunity. We want them to know that when we do take action, that it's going to be guided by our principles and values. So, standing up here as a liberal democratic or a representative from a liberal democratic nation, I would say I'm glad that there's that degree. I'm glad that we're drawing lines in the sand because, as I mentioned, these lines in the sand are really important for risk escalation and reducing potential misunderstandings in cyberspace. And I think the fact that no cyber activities yet to this point have escalated past. I guess it could be an academic. It could be an academic debate, but no cyber activities have really crossed that line yet. Maybe it's showing us that strategy is working, right?
Yeah, fair enough. Please.
And coming from the civilian sector, we don't draft such strategies that really tell our adversaries where the red lines are. It's more like in the defense sector. But I think one of the most important points is that it's for collaboration, so people see what your values are, which areas we find common ground, and what values are important when it comes to that.
Very good.
And as you say, a lot of things are also classified, and in the bureaucracy, nothing is written without very much thought. So I'm not too worried about giving away things we should not.
I love it. Excellent.
What did someone say this morning? Burn bureaucracy? It was there. I was like, as a bureaucrat, I was like,
Surprise.
Yeah, I think, I can't remember who said it, but someone said a few years ago, there's too many red lines in cyberspace. What is the permissible environment that we want malicious actors, where we say that isn't what we want, but yeah, that's an agreed kind of way of acting, right? Which is part of what US strategy is trying to do, at least Cyber Command strategy, to try and shape that environment. And I think the UK's let's call it novel interpretation of international law around these questions is trying to work out a way of moving beyond the sovereignty question as it's understood by most states to really say, well, why has nothing breached that? Because we are obviously having severe effects on different societies. And so I think there's something interesting there about why the UK has done something quite different to other states to say, actually, the lack of that line being crossed is an issue in itself, and we need to think of a different way of doing it. Whether that's going to be accepted by the international community is a completely different matter, but that's the motivation, I think, of where the UK comes from on this.
That's very interesting. I think it was General Hyten at the time that said we have an inclination to be very precise, very surgical, or very legalistic in our behavior. So among our allies, in a sense. So exposing that and informing our community, I would say, adversaries or allies, is key. Very cool. I did see, please go ahead, right up front here, and then there's one right behind as well. On the third row.
Hi, good afternoon. Chris Padilla. I'm the Deputy Commander, Allied Command Transformation. And what we do as prime task for NATO, we develop the core capabilities for NATO, as most of you know. So listening to all the comments you made, and I agree to coming from national strategy, going into doctrinal work and all those things. And what we do within NATO and within my command as well is harmonization, standardization, interoperability. We plan the capabilities in 5 domains, as you know: air, land, sea, space, and cyber. And space and cyber are different because, it's not a clear military domain anymore, the same with space. But from what you said, what I would be interested in your view is, at the end, if every nation develops its own capabilities, holds a lot of what they do within the cyber domain to themselves, develop, and it's understandable, this is what we see right now, and this is what we have to accept. But at the end of the day, with 31 nations, do you see the danger that we are splitting the cohesion of the alliance on the long run? Because we have 31 nations, and I see it day by day, you have nations, they are cyber powers and substations. They have a lot of, the cyber powers have a lot of money to invest. So what's your view? How do you take the smaller nations with less capabilities and less money along? Because at the end of the day, we have the common funded program within NATO, but common funded in cyber right now, it's debatable how you want to do take that forward. But I would see that as a way forward if you want to take 31 nations along. Yeah. Again, my question is, do you see that we split the alliance over time?
Interesting.
Right. I'll go first then.
Please.
I've probably maybe 2 comments to that. One of the speakers, I believe it was on the first day, the gentleman from the U.S. Cyber Solarium said, we don't need 31 boutique cyber capabilities. And as he said that, I kind of had a little thought to myself, and I thought, it doesn't. Again, back to my point about national equities, the alliance may not need 31 boutique cyber equities, but back to my point about that cyber operations and cyber capabilities serve purposes beyond just defense ones is really catching on in national strategies, right? We can use states can use cyber operations to achieve foreign affairs objectives, security objectives, advance other interests, right? So I think that it's really important to keep in mind that there are purposes just beyond defense, and a nation may not want to give up a tool like that can be used for their own to advance some of their own national interests. The second point I would make is capabilities go both ways, right? Offensive and defensive. And again, to a comment I made, the alliance cannot be secure and resilient if our smallest and our largest actors aren't capable of defending themselves or aren't capable of aren't capable of protecting and defending. And I think we made a comment about cybersecurity to cyber power. I think that's a really interesting, and I highly recommend everyone in this room read Andrew's paper because it's fascinating. It's really, really good. But I would almost say that when it comes to cybersecurity fits into cyber power. You can't have resiliency and security without the ability to respond. So in my mind, at least personally, cybersecurity and the ability to act in those capabilities all go hand in hand. So that's what I'd say to that question.
Fair answer.
From my perspective, I see a lot of cooperation also between small countries and large countries, really sharing knowledge. And we of course don't have the same budgets as the large countries, but it's not always about the money. We sometimes have quite some unique expertise and things that we also share back. It might be we were early with the early detection warning system among private companies in Norway, developed that. NATO built on that again. That's a capability. Within crypto, we have high expertise that NATO uses. So being a small country, we bring things to the table and we also get things back as well. So I think it's important. And what you talked about, space and cyber, and I think looking at different disciplines within the area, is needed. It's that's why we had the white paper just before Christmas, talking about national control and digital resilience to safeguard national security. It's really like it's so many different issues you need to take care of at the same time. It might be acquisitions, who owns different entities, and it's all so closely interlinked. So the cooperation and sharing among a lot of areas is needed, and really. From my seat, I see this cooperation with also the larger countries.
I'll just add one more point, which is capabilities are very different in cyber. So the transition nature of those capabilities means it's not that easy to share them because really it's so context dependent on the type of situation you're in. And so it's much about capacity building, which is, I think, something which has been happening quite significantly, right? And that's why I think it's gone down that route, because sharing capabilities probably just doesn't make sense. And that's why we see the US do the hunt forward operations, I think, partially as a way of saying, this is how we train you up to do defensive work in that case, but it could be applied in different ways, potentially.
Yeah, true.
Very interesting thoughts. Thank you. Another question right here, please.
Well, thanks very much. Bruce Watson with Canada's NSCOE. Thanks very much for all four of your thoughts on this. I'm going to direct this a little bit to Andrew with apologies. Everyone else is welcome to answer. But, you know, linguistically, at least the notion of cyber power has this resemblance to nuclear power, for example. So there's a macro question and a micro question here. One of them is to what extent is the UK then positioning this, for example, in the long term for Security Council membership, you know, whether being a cyber power is then a key factor in being able to play. And then at the micro level, you know, I've been in meetings actually also with Canada's Privy Council office where we discussed access to advanced things like quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and so on. And, you know, years ago, the Netherlands needed, and other countries brought in similar things, what we call the AQ-Khan laws, which was the access for students to, or academics from outside to advanced technologies like that. And to what extent, this is now the micro part of the question, will you see this kind of thing in the UK, you know, where foreign students no longer are welcome studying cyber-related things? Thanks.
Oh, you've given me a great question because I can talk about foreign students and talk about student numbers, which like academic in the UK is
We may want to just clarify the AQK policy that's been brought up here, just to make sure everyone understands what that's about.
Yeah, so I think I'll go through the question and I'll get to that. I think the question around Security Council membership is really interesting. The UK potentially might see a breakup within a generation, potentially not soon, but it means that nuclear power may not be a thing in the UK anymore. So what justifies its presence on the Security Council, I think is a really interesting question, whether that's part of that. I don't think of my heart of hearts and discussions that it's that well thought through. That might be an implication in the future. It might get reused in that way. And then I think around UK is heavily dependent on foreign students for its higher education sector, as are many other countries. And there's been a tension really since the relationship with China soured from 2015, 2016 onwards about how to deal with that. I can't imagine that the economics of it and the way that the government funds higher education, I don't think it will change from what it's currently at. It might be that it's very, very sector specific, very high value to technologies that might lead to that. And going back to Professor Ross Anderson's talk earlier, most of his students are not UK nationals or from NATO states. So this is it's going to be a perpetual problem potentially for the UK.
That's a good question, though. That's difficult policy challenges that we face, you know. If I may, we have 5 minutes left, and I don't see any really big hands rising up, but I do have something to offer here. So the challenge of responding to ever-changing requirements for policy, I think, is another thing that was brought up in the kind of summary of this panel and session. So in light of, obviously, Russia's recent and longer previous, since 2014, invasion into Ukraine, and it's been in the forefront of our minds, and thereby likely and hopefully impacting our strategic and policy directions. I was at the MSC this February in a panel titled "How Should NATO Respond to Russian Belligerence in Eastern Europe?" And a German general asked an interesting question of the panel, to which the director within NATO HQ's Defense Policy and Planning Division responded. But I'm not going to give her a response. I will ask the 4 questions, and I will ask you folks, how do you feel your policy has possibly changed shape in the last few months, few years, with respect to this obviously escalating behavior? I will say over years we've followed the Russian behavior escalating. So the 4 questions that they asked, well, the single question they asked was, what is the goal? 1, Russia leaving Ukraine. 2, Russia losing. 3, Ukraine not losing. Or 4, Ukraine winning. And those are 4 distinct, different outcomes, not necessarily mutually exclusive. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so I'll pass that to you in your policy development. Have you seen anything in the recent or since 2014, if we're lucky to see shaping of this? Please.
Maybe I'll kick off. I mean, so Canada's defense strategy was published in 2017, and I think we had identified, obviously, at that point, and seen some of the writing on the wall, right? We had the annexation of Crimea. We had seen indications that this situation could get worse. I think what we didn't see, and I think what a lot of allies are admitting now that we all didn't see, was the pace that this would come at. And I think the UK has acknowledged this, and that was the reason for their integrated review refresh and why it had to happen so quickly. This is why our defense policy update had to happen. It's not because we didn't see it coming. It's because we didn't see it was going to be like
super fast.
Super fast, exactly. So I would say that in the policy environment, that has shaped a speed up of clarification and again just reiterating what was maybe in our original policies, but acknowledging that the threats and the strategic situations that we had identified in those policies came a lot quicker than anticipated.
Very cool. Rob?
Yeah, I think like the pandemic in itself showed that we can adapt and do things much faster than ever before.
Yep.
Very good.
And also coming to the invasion of Ukraine, we saw in Norway we had very quickly a budget increase with the new actions to meet the changing environment, and also the white paper I mentioned that came before Christmas. We started that process. Yeah, I think it was in June last year, finished writing it in October. And that's a result of the changing landscape, but not only the Ukraine war, but also what we've seen over time. But it probably was an accelerator for that process. So that's the updated policy. And so the strategy is not always the answer, but comes in different forms.
Well, turnaround in 4 months, that's reasonable, actually very fast for policy, in my opinion.
Speed of light,
yeah, absolutely, one would say.
So, Treena, obviously, you mentioned...
I stole your point.
You did partially steal my point. One of the advantages of being an academic is I can also expand because I'm not a representative of the state. And I think it's about how the politics of this really shaped the UK's response. It was, in my more critical mindset, Ukraine offered the UK an opportunity to demonstrate its commitment to Europe, which it hadn't before. And so actually what it's done is reorientated the UK to Europe in cyber policy, but also broadly. It's about showing actually cyber strategy and policy doesn't sit as like its own vehicle somewhere else. Actually, it's part of this broader makeup of what a state's wanting to do in the world.
Well, with a few seconds left in this panel, I want to thank all of you for the three of you actually for coming out here and spending your time and sharing your thoughts as well with our audience and CyCon as a whole. I hope this discussion continues on, and not just for today, but over the next few days. You'll have more policy panels coming through, and obviously we have our fabulous panel here at your disposal to attack in the battlefield over there. Thank you. I will do this deed here of presenting these pieces.
Thanks, Neal.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.